Picture an archaeologist in 1994, standing on a dusty hilltop in southeastern Turkey. Now picture what's beneath his feet. Strip away the soil, the centuries of accumulated earth, the deliberate burial. Stand him above what's actually there. Here's the uncomfortable truth. He's standing on top of the oldest known temple complex in human history, built 11,600 years ago, before agriculture, before pottery, before metal tools, before civilization as we understand it. That structure beneath his feet, those massive stone pillars arranged in perfect circles, they shouldn't exist. Not there, not then, not built by people we thought were simple hunter-gatherers, barely surviving in small nomadic bands. Now, think about your history textbook, the one that told you how civilization began. First, humans learned to farm. Then they settled down. Then they had surplus food and leisure time. Then they developed specialization and social hierarchy. And finally, after all of that, they built monuments, temples, ceremonial structures. The story was neat, logical, progressive, each step naturally leading to the next. Göbekli Tepe, the site that archaeologists were standing on, proved we had the entire sequence backward. This temple complex predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000 years. It predates the invention of pottery, the domestication of animals, the development of agriculture itself. When these pillars were being carved and erected, humans hadn't planted their first crop. They were still hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants. They lived in temporary camps, following seasonal resources, moving with the herds. And yet somehow they built this. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I read the comments and it's wild. Toronto at twilight, Berlin at bedtime, Sydney at sunrise, all watching the same stone circles that have been waiting for us to understand them for 11,600 years. This is one of the most important archaeological discoveries in human history, and it changed everything we thought we knew about our past. For over a century, archaeologists and anthropologists had constructed a story about how civilization emerged, a clear progression supported by evidence from dozens of sites. Agriculture came first because you needed reliable food sources, then permanent settlements because farmers can't be nomadic, then social complexity and specialization because surplus food freed some people from food production. Then religion and ritual became formalized, and finally, once you had all of that, once you had the social organization and the surplus resources, then you could build monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe demolished this timeline completely. The people who built this temple complex weren't farmers. They had no domesticated plants or animals. They weren't living in permanent settlements. They had no pottery to store surplus food, no metal tools to make construction easier, no wheels to transport the massive stones. They were, by every definition we'd established, Stone Age hunter-gatherers. The kind of people we thought spent all their energy just surviving. The kind of people who supposedly didn't have time or resources for anything beyond meeting basic needs. But they carved 20-ton limestone pillars covered with sophisticated animal reliefs. They transported these pillars from quarries hundreds of yards away. They erected them in precise geometric patterns. They created at least 20 circular structures, each one requiring years of coordinated labor. They maintained this complex for over 500 years. That shouldn't be possible. It violates everything we'd constructed about how human societies develop, about what drives us to create, about the relationship between subsistence and culture. The archaeological establishment had spent decades building models of cultural evolution. Göbekli Tepe required throwing most of them out. And here's what makes it even more profound. This wasn't just one anomalous site. It was the epicenter of a cultural phenomenon that spread across thousands of square miles. Similar structures built by similar people at similar times. An entire civilization we never knew existed, operating according to rules we never imagined. This is the story of the temple that came first, the structure that rewrote prehistory, the artifact that proved our ancestors were capable of things we never gave them credit for. And it starts with understanding what the world looked like when someone decided to build it. Because once you see the context, once you understand what was actually happening 11,600 years ago, the impossibility of this place becomes even more staggering. The artifact that rewrote prehistory, history for sleep. Picture an archaeologist in 1994. standing on a dusty hilltop in southeastern Turkey. Now picture what's beneath his feet. Strip away the soil, the centuries of accumulated earth, the deliberate burial. Stand him above what's actually there. Here's the uncomfortable truth. He's standing on top of the oldest known temple complex in human history, built 11,600 years ago, before agriculture, before pottery, before metal tools, before civilization as we understand it. That structure beneath his feet, those massive stone pillars arranged in perfect circles, they shouldn't exist. Not there. Not then. Not built by people we thought were simple hunter-gatherers barely surviving in small nomadic bands. Now think about your history textbook, the one that told you how civilization began. First, humans learned to farm, then they settled down, then they had surplus food and leisure time, then they developed specialization and social hierarchy, and finally, after all of that, they built monuments, temples, ceremonial structures. The story was neat, logical, progressive, each step naturally leading to the next. Göbekli Tepe, the site that archaeologists were standing on, proved we had the entire sequence backward. This temple complex predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000 years. It predates the invention of pottery, the domestication of animals, the development of agriculture itself. When these pillars were being carved and erected, humans hadn't planted their first crop. They were still hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants. They lived in temporary camps, following seasonal resources, moving with the herds, and yet somehow they built this. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos, so maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I read the comments and it's wild. Toronto at twilight, Berlin at bedtime, Sydney at sunrise, all watching the same stone circles that have been waiting for us to understand them for 11,600 years. This is one of the most important archaeological discoveries in human history, and it changed everything we thought we knew about our past. For over a century, archaeologists and anthropologists had constructed a story about how civilization emerged, a clear progression supported by evidence from dozens of sites. Agriculture came first, because you needed reliable food sources, then permanent settlements, because farmers can't be nomadic, then social complexity and specialization, because surplus food freed some people from food production. Then religion and ritual became formalized. And finally, once you had all of that, once you had the social organization and the surplus resources, then you could build monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe demolished this timeline completely. The people who built this temple complex weren't farmers. They had no domesticated plants or animals. They weren't living in permanent settlements. They had no pottery to store surplus food, no metal tools to make construction easier, no wheels to transport the massive stones. They were, by every definition we'd established, Stone Age hunter-gatherers. The kind of people we thought spent all their energy just surviving. The kind of people who supposedly didn't have time or resources for anything beyond meeting basic needs. But they carved 20-ton limestone pillars covered with sophisticated animal reliefs. They transported these pillars from quarries hundreds of yards away. They erected them in precise geometric patterns. They created at least 20 circular structures, each one requiring years of coordinated labor. They maintained this complex for over 1,500 years. That shouldn't be possible. It violates everything we'd constructed about how human societies develop, about what drives us to create, about the relationship between subsistence and culture. The archaeological establishment had spent decades building models of cultural evolution. Göbekli Tepe required throwing most of them out. And here's what makes it even more profound. This wasn't just one anomalous site. It was the epicenter of a cultural phenomenon that spread across thousands of square miles. Similar structures built by similar people at similar times. An entire civilization we never knew existed, operating according to rules we never imagined. This is the story of the temple that came first. The structure that rewrote prehistory. The artifact that proved our ancestors were capable of things we never gave them credit for. And it starts with understanding what the world looked like when someone decided to build it. Because once you see the context, once you understand what was actually happening 11,600 years ago, the impossibility of this place becomes even more staggering. Around 11,600 years ago, the world was just emerging from the last ice age. Not fully emerged, still transitioning. Glaciers that had covered entire continents for 100,000 years were finally retreating. Sea levels were rising, somewhere between 200 and 400 feet lower than today, exposing vast coastal plains that are now underwater. Coastlines were changing. The climate was warming, but it was unstable, unpredictable, swinging between cold snaps and warm periods with a violence that would devastate ecosystems. Your ancestors were living through something called the Younger Dryas, a period of dramatic climate fluctuation that lasted from about 10,900 to 9,700 BCE. The name comes from a small Arctic flower, Dryas octopetala, whose pollen appears in sediment layers from this period, indicating cold conditions returning to regions that had been warming. Just when things seemed to be warming up permanently, when forests were expanding and ice sheets retreating, temperatures would plunge again. In some regions, temperatures dropped by as much as 15 degrees Celsius within a single decade. Ecosystems that had started adapting to warmer conditions would suddenly face near glacial cold, then warm again, then cold. The planet couldn't make up its mind. This wasn't just uncomfortable weather, this was extinction-level climate chaos. Megafauna that had survived the Ice Age itself, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, started disappearing. Some because of climate stress, some because of human hunting, probably most because of both factors working together. The world your ancestors inhabited was dangerous, unpredictable, and getting more so. In this world, humans were scattered across the continents in small mobile bands. Global population estimates for this period put total human numbers at maybe 5 to 10 million people worldwide. Compare that to today's 8 billion, and you get a sense of how empty the world was. In any given region, you might have a few hundred people spread across thousands of square miles. Population density was incredibly low, contact between groups infrequent, the landscape vast and mostly uninhabited. A typical band consisted of maybe 30 to 50 people, sometimes fewer during hard times, occasionally more during seasonal gatherings. Extended. Families mostly, everyone related by blood or marriage, everyone knowing everyone else intimately. They moved seasonally, following animal migrations, tracking the ripening of wild plant foods. When the gazelle herds moved north in spring, your ancestors moved with them. When certain nuts or fruits ripened in the valleys, they were there to harvest them. When winter came, they retreated to sheltered locations, caves or rock overhangs, or carefully constructed windbreaks, where they could wait out the cold months. This was survival at its most fundamental. Every day was about finding enough calories to make it to the next day. Every decision was calculated against energy expenditure. A human needs roughly 2,000 to 2,500 calories per day just to maintain basic metabolic functions, keep warm, move around, think. An active hunter-gatherer probably needed closer to 3,000 calories per day to account for all the physical activity required for survival. Getting those calories through hunting and gathering required most of their waking hours. Here's the math. A successful hunt might bring down an animal with 50,000 to 100,000 calories of usable meat. Sounds like a lot. But that has to feed the entire band, and it has to account for the energy expended in the hunt. If 10 hunters spend an entire day tracking, chasing, killing, and butchering an animal, they've collectively expended maybe 30,000 calories. If the animal provides 75,000 calories, that's a net gain of 45,000 calories split among 50 people. That's 900 calories per person, not even half of daily needs. You need to supplement with gathered plants, which means hours of foraging, processing, preparing. The energy budget was tight, very tight. There was no surplus time, no leisure hours to spend carving elaborate pillars or organizing massive construction projects. Hunt in the morning, process the kill, gather plants in the afternoon, prepare food, maintain tools and clothing, care for children, maintain social bonds, deal with conflicts, treat injuries. The day was full. Anthropologists had studied modern hunter-gatherers extensively to understand how our ancestors lived. Groups in the Kalahari Desert like the Kungzan, Aboriginal Australians in the outback, the Hadza in Tanzania, the H in Paraguay, and the pattern was consistent across different environments and continents. These societies were egalitarian, non-hierarchical, focused entirely on immediate needs. They had rich cultural lives, yes. Sophisticated knowledge of their environments, complex social relationships, elaborate oral traditions, shamanic practices, coming-of-age ceremonies, the full range of human culture. But monumental architecture, permanent structures requiring years of coordinated labour, that wasn't part of the hunter-gatherer package. The Kung, for example, spend about 15 to 20 hours per week actively foraging for food. That sounds like a lot of free time, and anthropologists in the 1960s made a big deal about this, calling them the original affluent society. But those 15 to 20 hours don't include all the other survival activities: tool maintenance, several hours per week, food processing, especially processing mongongo nuts, their staple plant food, hours more, collecting firewood and maintaining fires, more time, making and repairing clothing and bags and containers, more time, caring for children who aren't independent until age 5 or 6. Add it all up, and there's not much slack in the system. And even if somehow there was time, even if some group managed to be so efficient at getting food that they had hours left over every day, there was no organizational structure to coordinate large-scale construction projects. Hunter-gatherer bands were fluid, democratic, consensus-based. Leadership was temporary and task-specific. The best hunter might lead during a hunt, directing others, making tactical decisions, but had no authority to command others afterward. The best tracker might lead when following game. The most knowledgeable herbalist might lead in plant gathering. But none of these roles were permanent or gave anyone power over others. Anthropologists call this egalitarianism. Not equality in abilities. Everyone recognized that some people were better hunters or better trackers or better storytellers, but equality in social power. No one could tell anyone else what to do. Decisions were made by consensus. If you didn't like the decision, you could leave and join another band or form your own. Social control came through reputation and shame, not through hierarchy or force. The idea of someone directing hundreds of people in a multi-year construction project that required the kind of hierarchical social structure that supposedly only emerged after agriculture created surplus resources and permanent settlements. You need authority to coordinate large groups. You need some people giving orders and others following them. You need specialists who aren't producing their own food. You need administrators managing resources and labour. None of this existed in hunter-gatherer societies, or so we thought. This wasn't speculation. This was based on decades of archaeological evidence and anthropological observation. Sites from this period, from North America to Europe to Asia, showed the same pattern. Small temporary camps, usually just a few hearths, some stone tool debris, maybe some bone fragments from meals. Simple stone tools, the same basic technology that had existed for tens of thousands of years. Flint blades, scrapers, burins for working bone and antler. Portable possessions, everything light enough to carry when the band moved. Evidence of mobile lifestyles, camps occupied for a few weeks or months and then abandoned. No permanent structures beyond simple windbreaks or hide-covered frames. Certainly nothing approaching monumental architecture. The earliest known permanent structures from this period were pit houses, essentially holes dug into the ground, with roofs made of branches and hides. Functional, practical, nothing elaborate. These appeared in regions where resources were so concentrated and reliable that people could stay in one place for longer periods. But even these were small, individual family dwellings, not communal structures. The archaeological record from Europe at this time, the late Upper Paleolithic transitioning into the Mesolithic, shows small hunting camps along rivers and lakes, stone tool scatters, occasional bone tools, sometimes engraved bone or antler with decorative patterns, showing that these people had artistic sensibilities. But no architecture to speak of, nothing permanent, nothing monumental. The same pattern in North America, where humans had arrived maybe 15,000 years ago, spreading rapidly across the continents. Clovis points, the distinctive fluted spear points, found scattered across the landscape. Evidence of mammoth and mastodon hunting. Butchery sites where kills were processed, but no structures, no monuments, no indication of anything beyond mobile foraging and hunting. In East Asia, similar patterns, small camps, stone tools, evidence of fishing and hunting. The Japanese archipelago had some of the earliest known pottery in the world, Jomonware dating back to around 14,000 BCE. But even these pottery-making groups were mobile hunter-gatherers. The pottery allowed them to process plant foods more efficiently, particularly nuts and shellfish, but didn't lead to monumental architecture. They made beautiful ceramics, elaborate cord-marked vessels, but they didn't build temples. Think about that. Across the entire world, from Africa to Europe to Asia to the Americas, the pattern was the same. Mobile hunter-gatherers, simple temporary camps, no permanent structures, no monumental architecture. This wasn't an accident or a gap in the archaeological record. This was the human condition at this time, the way humans had lived for hundreds of thousands of years, the way most humans would continue living for several more thousand years. The first known permanent settlements appeared around 10,000 BCE in the Fertile Crescent, that arc of fertile land stretching from the Persian Gulf through modern Iraq and Syria to the Mediterranean coast. Places like Jericho, one of the earliest known permanent settlements, where people began staying year-round instead of moving seasonally. They built mud brick houses, round structures about 5 meters in diameter, clustered together in a small village. Archaeological evidence shows these early Jericho inhabitants were still hunting gazelle and gathering wild plants, but they were staying put. Why did they settle at Jericho specifically? Water. A powerful spring provided reliable water year-round, and water attracts game animals. The surrounding area had abundant wild cereals, gazelle herds passing through on migration, and a climate that made year-round occupation possible. But even these early settlements were small. Jericho, in its earliest phases, had maybe 70 people, a few dozen structures, and this was considered revolutionary, a major change in human behaviour, and they appeared after the first experiments with plant domestication, after people had begun the slow transition toward agriculture. The earliest evidence of plant cultivation comes from the same region, the Fertile Crescent, around 2500 to 10,000 BCE. Wild einkorn wheat showing morphological changes suggesting human cultivation. Wild barley with similar changes, rye being managed, if not fully domesticated. People were beginning to intervene in plant reproduction, selecting seeds from desirable plants, sowing them in cleared areas, protecting them from wild animals. This was the established narrative. Settlement and agriculture emerged together, each enabling the other. You settle down because you're investing in crops that need tending. You can farm because you're settled and can protect your fields. The two processes reinforced each other, and once you had both, once you had permanent villages and domesticated crops, then social complexity could develop. Surplus food meant some people could specialize. Specialization led to hierarchy. Hierarchy enabled large-scale labor coordination, and eventually, thousands of years later, you got monumental architecture. The earliest known monumental structures in this narrative dated to around 5000 to 4000 BCE. The temples at Uruk in Mesopotamia, massive mud brick platforms supporting elaborate structures. The megalithic tombs of Western Europe, huge stone chambers covered with earth mounds. The earliest ziggurats. These required agricultural surplus to feed the builders. They required permanent settlements to house the labourers. They required social stratification to organise and direct the work. They required pottery to store food, bronze tools to shape stone, wheeled vehicles to transport materials, writing to keep track of resources. They required everything that hunter-gatherers didn't have. That was the world into which Göbekli Tepe was supposedly built. A world of nomadic bands, seasonal camps, hand-to-mouth survival, and egalitarian social structures. A world where nobody should have had the time, the resources, the social organisation, or the motivation to carve 20-ton limestone pillars and arrange them in precise geometric patterns. A world where monumental architecture was impossible by definition, because all the preconditions for it didn't exist yet. But someone did it anyway, and understanding how they did it, understanding what made it possible, understanding why they chose to invest so much in something that had no practical survival value, that changes everything we thought we knew about human capabilities, human motivation, human social organisation, and the forces that drive us to create. The answer isn't simple. It's not just one factor. It's a perfect storm of environmental conditions, cultural developments, and human psychology that converged at one place at one time to make the impossible happen. Picture this. You're standing inside one of the completed circles at Göbekli Tepe, 11 to 500 years ago. It's night. The stone pillars around you are 18 feet tall, some reaching 20 feet, weighing between 10 and 20 tons each. Their surfaces are covered with carved reliefs, foxes stalking through geometric patterns, lions frozen in mid-stride, muscles defined, faces snarling, scorpions with curved tails raised to strike, vultures with wings spread wide, each feather individually carved, snakes coiling across the stone surface, scales rendered in careful detail, wild boars charging, tusks prominent, spiders with legs extended across the limestone, all rendered with stunning naturalism, three-dimensional relief carving that creates depth and shadow. The pillars are arranged in perfect circles, measuring 30 feet across, some smaller at 20 feet, some larger at 40. The geometry is precise, not approximate. These weren't eyeballed. Someone measured, someone calculated, someone understood circular geometry well enough to place pillars at exact intervals around a perfect circumference. The largest pillars always stand in the center of each circle, anthropomorphic, T-shaped, positioned precisely in the middle, always facing the same direction. They're not standing parallel. They face each other, as if in conversation, as if witnessing something together. Look at these central pillars more closely. They have arms. Not fully sculpted, but carved in relief along their sides, bent at the elbow, hands meeting at the center of the shaft. What are they holding? Their bellies? Something invisible? We don't know. Some have clothing depicted, belts carved around their midsections, decorated with geometric patterns. Some have loincloths or foxskin garments rendered in stone. One pillar, pillar 18 in enclosure D, has a foxskin garment so detailed you can see where the tail hangs down. These aren't just architectural elements, they're representations of beings. Ancestors maybe, or gods, or humans transformed into something beyond human. Witnesses to rituals we can barely imagine. This isn't one structure, it's at least 20 of them, scattered across the hilltop covering an area of about 22 acres, each circle slightly different, each one featuring similar architectural elements but unique decorative programs. Enclosure A emphasizes wild boars and foxes. Enclosure B has more abstract geometric symbols, H-shaped figures that might represent stylized humans or might represent concepts we don't yet understand. Enclosure C features predominantly large mammals, aurochs and gazelles. Enclosure D, the best preserved and most completely excavated, has the most elaborate animal program, with over 40 distinct carved figures identified so far, and probably more still hidden under centuries of limestone crust and weathering. The variety suggests different groups, different purposes, maybe different time periods within the site's long occupation. Radiocarbon dating shows that construction and use spanned at least 1,500 years, from about 9600 BCE to 8000 BCE. That's longer than the entire history of the Roman Empire. Imagine maintaining a religious site for that long, generation after generation coming back, repairing pillars, adding new structures, maintaining traditions across the centuries. The T-shaped pillars are the signature element, found at every related site in the region. The crossbar at the top gives them an anthropomorphic quality, like broad shoulders viewed from behind. Height varies from about 10 feet for the smallest to 20 feet for the largest. Weight ranges accordingly, from perhaps 5 tons for a smaller pillar to over 20 tons for the massive central pillars in enclosure D. These central pillars, designated pillars 18 and 31, stand 18 feet tall and weigh an estimated 15 to 20 tons each. 20 tons, 40,000 pounds, of solid limestone. The limestone itself is local, quarried from the bedrock on the same hilltop. Archaeologists have found the quarries, roughly 500 feet from the structures, where massive trenches were cut into the bedrock to extract the pillars. You can still see unfinished pillars in the quarry, partially cut from the stone, showing the process. Workers would create trenches around the desired block, several feet deep on 3 sides. Then they'd undercut it, carving away the stone beneath until the pillar was attached only at one end. Finally, they'd break it free, probably by driving wooden wedges into strategic cracks and either pounding them or wetting them to make them expand. This required understanding stone grain, knowing where the natural fracture planes lay, having the patience to work slowly and carefully so the pillar didn't shatter. Limestone is sedimentary rock, formed from compressed calcium carbonate deposits, usually from ancient seas. It can be relatively soft, easier to work than granite or basalt, but it's also brittle. Hit it wrong and it shatters. Your ancestors had to understand the material intimately, had to know from experience and transmitted knowledge exactly how to work it. And they had to do this with Stone Age tools. No metal, no steel chisels or iron hammers, flint and obsidian, stone striking stone. Flint is hard enough to chip limestone, and obsidian, volcanic glass, can create an edge sharper than surgical steel. But both are brittle, they break. You go through dozens, hundreds of tools on a single project. The archaeological evidence at Göbekli Tepe includes thousands of flint and obsidian fragments, debitage from tool production and use, the refuse of stone-on-stone construction. The carvings were made with these same tools. Look again at the animal reliefs. These aren't simple stick figures or crude outlines. These are sophisticated three-dimensional carvings showing anatomy, musculature, posture, movement. A fox in mid-stride, weight shifted to its front legs, tail extended for balance. A lion with its mouth open, you can count the teeth. A vulture with its head tilted, examining something below, each feather on the wing defined individually. The carvers understood perspective and foreshortening. They could represent three-dimensional forms on a two-dimensional surface, making animals appear to emerge from the stone. They understood how light and shadow work, how depth of carving creates the illusion of form. Some reliefs are carved several inches deep, creating dramatic shadows that make the animals seem to move as the sun crosses the sky. This is artistic sophistication that rivals anything from later civilizations. The animal reliefs at Göbekli Tepe are as well executed as Egyptian tomb paintings from 5,000 years later, as naturalistic as Greek sculpture from 7,000 years later. Your ancestors weren't primitives crudely scratching at stone. They were artists, skilled craftspeople who understood their medium and their subjects intimately. Now think about the logistics. Each pillar weighs 10 to 20 tons. The quarry is about 500 feet from the structures. Your ancestors had to move these massive blocks without wheels, without draft animals, without metal tools or equipment. How do you move 20 tons of stone under those conditions? You use people. Lots of people. Archaeological experiments have been conducted to understand prehistoric construction techniques. In one experiment, researchers attempted to move a 10-ton stone block using Neolithic technology. They needed approximately 500 people pulling on ropes to move it across level ground. 500 people, all coordinating their efforts, all pulling in unison, all maintaining tension on the ropes, and that's on level ground. Göbekli Tepe sits on a hilltop. The quarry is downslope from some of the structures, which means your ancestors were pulling these stones uphill. That requires even more people, or the same number working much harder, or clever use of levers and rollers and inclined planes to reduce the force needed. Think about organizing 500 people to move a single pillar. Everyone has to understand their role. Everyone has to pull at the same moment, maintain the same tension, respond to directions. You need a system of communication, probably rhythmic chanting or drumming, to keep everyone synchronized. You need leadership, someone directing the operation, making decisions about when to rest, when to adjust course, how to handle obstacles. You need safety measures, because if that stone tips, if those ropes break, people will be crushed. And this happened dozens of times. Each structure has multiple pillars. Enclosure D has 12 pillars around its perimeter, plus 2 massive central pillars. That's 14 pillars, each requiring its own quarrying, its own carving, its own transport, its own erection. If each pillar took 500 people to move and weeks to carve and days to quarry and erect, the labour investment per structure is staggering. Multiply that by 20 structures, and you're looking at tens of thousands of person-hours, probably hundreds of thousands invested in this complex. Then you have to erect the pillars. An 18-foot, 15-ton pillar has to be raised from horizontal to vertical position, without toppling and crushing anyone. This requires stone sockets cut into the bedrock to receive the base of the pillar. These sockets are carefully shaped, angled slightly to direct the pillar into the correct upright position. They're deep enough to secure the pillar, but not so deep that it would be impossible to maneuver the base into place. The erection process probably involved digging a ramp on one side of the socket, sliding the pillar along the ground until its base was positioned near the socket, then using levers and ropes and wooden scaffolding to gradually tilt it upward. As the pillar approaches vertical, its weight shifts, becoming easier to raise but also more dangerous if it tips the wrong way. The final positioning requires careful coordination. Once vertical, the socket would be packed with smaller stones to secure the pillar in place. This is engineering. Not accidental, not trial and error, but careful planning and execution based on understanding of physics and materials. Someone understood how levers work, how to calculate the forces needed, how to position supports, how to control the movement of massive weights. This knowledge had to be transmitted, probably through apprenticeship, master craftspeople teaching helpers the techniques refined over generations. The circles themselves show sophisticated architectural understanding. They're not just pillars stuck randomly in the ground. They have walls, low stone walls connecting the pillars around the perimeter, creating enclosed spaces. These walls are carefully fitted dry stone construction without mortar, each stone shaped to fit against its neighbours. The technique requires skill, understanding how stones lock together, how weight distributes, how to create stable structures from irregular materials. Inside the circles are stone benches, low platforms running along the inner perimeter walls, about 18 inches high, wide enough to sit on. These benches create an interior space, an audience area facing the central pillars. This is deliberate architectural design, creating spaces for human activity, for gathering, for witnessing whatever rituals or ceremonies occurred here. The floors are carefully prepared, bedrock exposed and levelled, sometimes plastered with terrazzo, a mixture of crushed limestone and water that hardens into a smooth surface. This isn't just stamped earth, this is finished flooring, showing attention to detail and aesthetic concerns. Some enclosures have small channels cut into the floors, shallow grooves running in geometric patterns or leading from the centre toward the perimeter walls. Their purpose is unknown. Drainage channels for liquids, symbolic representations of water or blood, guides for processions. We can only speculate. There's evidence of astronomical alignment. Some researchers, analysing the orientation of the pillars and enclosures, argue that certain structures align with celestial phenomena visible in the night sky 11,600 years ago. The central pillars in enclosure D, for instance, appear to align with the rising point of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, during the summer months around 9600 BCE. Whether this was intentional or coincidental is debated, but the precision suggests intentionality. Other proposed alignments include orientation toward the summer solstice sunrise, winter solstice sunset, and various star groups that would have been visible and prominent in the Neolithic sky. If these alignments are intentional, they suggest sophisticated astronomical knowledge, people tracking celestial movements over long periods, understanding the cycles of stars and seasons, incorporating that knowledge into their sacred architecture. Here's where it gets really interesting. Around 8000 BCE, after maintaining these structures for over 500 years, after investing generations of labour, after incorporating these circles into their ritual and social life for millennia, the people who built Göbekli Tepe did something extraordinary. They buried it, deliberately, carefully, systematically. This wasn't abandonment. The structures weren't left to decay. They weren't destroyed by enemies or natural disasters. They were filled in. Every circle was carefully packed with soil and limestone rubble. Thousands of tons of material, carried in basket by basket, packed down over and around the pillars. The fill was deposited carefully, sometimes containing special objects, broken tools, animal bones, stone bowls, as if offerings were being included in the burial. This deliberate burial is why the site survived so well. The fill protected the pillars from 10,000 years of weathering. When rain falls on exposed limestone, it slowly dissolves the surface. Wind carries abrasive sand that grinds away detail. Temperature fluctuations cause expansion and contraction that cracks stone. Over 10,000 years, exposed pillars would have been reduced to weathered stumps, carvings erased, details lost, but the fill protected them. When archaeologists began excavating in 1995, removing that fill layer by layer, they found pillars still standing exactly as they'd been positioned 11,600 years ago. Carvings still crisp and detailed, architectural features still intact. The limestone had developed a patina, a weathered surface crust, but beneath that the stone was remarkably well preserved. This is the paradox. The act of ending the site, of deliberately burying it, is what allowed it to survive long enough to tell us its story. Think about that. 20 circular structures, each one requiring years of labour, decades of planning, generations of knowledge transmission. Built by people who supposedly had no settlements, no surplus food, no leisure time, no reason to create. Something that served no practical survival purpose. The archaeological evidence doesn't just challenge our assumptions, it demolishes them completely. Everything we thought we knew about what hunter-gatherers could or couldn't do, what motivated them, how they organised themselves, all of it proven wrong by these stone circles standing in the darkness. But the really wild part isn't what they built, it's why they built it. because when archaeologists started analysing the site more carefully, looking at the bones scattered across the floors, the tools embedded in the fill layers, the environmental evidence from pollen and plant remains, they discovered something that changed the entire narrative of human civilization. They found proof of who built it, how they lived, what they ate, and most importantly, what drove them to create something this ambitious when every practical consideration said it was impossible. Something extraordinary happened at Göbekli Tepe around 11,600 years ago. Something that had never occurred in human history, at least not at this scale, not with this level of organisation, not with this clarity of purpose. Hundreds of people, maybe thousands, came together from across the region. Not to hunt, though there was hunting. Not to fight, though there may have been competition and display. Not to trade, though exchange certainly occurred. They came together to build, and to feast, and to participate in something we still don't fully understand. A gathering that required a level of social coordination that shouldn't have been possible for hunter-gatherers, a sustained commitment that defies everything we thought we knew about mobile foraging societies. The evidence is in the bones. Tens of thousands of animal bones scattered across the site, concentrated in certain areas, particularly in the fill layers and around the perimeters of the enclosures. The bone assemblage tells a clear story once you know how to read it. This wasn't the scattered debris of small family meals consumed over years of occupation. This was mass consumption, feasting on a scale that required hundreds of animals killed and butchered in relatively short time periods. The bones are predominantly gazelle, making up over 60% of the identified specimens. Gazella subguturosa, the Persian gazelle, a medium-sized antelope that migrates seasonally through the region. But there are also bones from wild cattle, aurochs, massive animals standing 6 feet at the shoulder, providing enormous amounts of meat. Wild boar bones, from animals that lived in the oak forests. Wild sheep and goats from the rocky hillsides. Bird bones, including wild geese and ducks. Even reptile bones, though these are less common. Here's what's fascinating. The bone assemblage doesn't show the pattern you'd expect from a permanent settlement where people lived year-round. In a settlement, you'd see a diverse mixture of species hunted throughout the year, with proportions reflecting seasonal availability. You'd see bones from all age classes of animals, young and old, male and female, because you're hunting opportunistically, taking whatever you can get whenever you can get it. The bones at Göbekli Tepe show something different. The gazelle bones are predominantly from young adult males killed during autumn months. How do we know this? From the teeth. Gazelle teeth erupt and wear down in predictable patterns as the animal ages. By examining tooth eruption and wear, zooarchaeologists can determine age at death with reasonable precision. The gazelle at Göbekli Tepe were killed primarily at 2 to 3 years old, young adults in their prime, and we know they were killed in autumn because that's when gazelle migration patterns brought large herds through this region. Modern studies of gazelle behaviour, combined with paleoclimatic data about vegetation and water availability 11,600 years ago, allow researchers to reconstruct ancient migration routes. The herds would have moved south through the Göbekli Tepe region in autumn, heading toward winter grazing areas. This was when they were most abundant, most accessible, most easily hunted in large numbers. The aurochs' bones tell a similar story. These massive wild cattle were hunted primarily in late summer and autumn, when they congregated in valleys with reliable water sources. The age profile shows selective hunting of prime age adults, the animals providing the most meat with the least risk. Hunting aurochs was dangerous. A full-grown bull could weigh 3,000 pounds, stood as tall as a person at the shoulder, had horns capable of goring a hunter. Taking one down required coordinated effort, multiple hunters with spears, careful planning, and considerable bravery. The bone quantities are staggering. In Enclosure D alone, excavators found remains from an estimated 400 to 500 gazelles. 400 gazelles. At 100 pounds of meat per animal, that's 40,000 to 50,000 pounds of meat, enough to feed 500 people for several weeks. And that's just one enclosure, and probably not even the complete assemblage since some bones were lost to weathering and disturbance over millennia. Think about what this means. This wasn't regular daily subsistence hunting. This was specialized mass hunting during seasonal abundance, followed by massive communal feasting. Your ancestors were coming together, probably from a wide area, converging on this hilltop during autumn when resources were abundant, when the gazelle herds were passing through, when the weather was still good enough for large gatherings. They were hunting on a massive scale, killing dozens of animals in coordinated drives, butchering them, cooking them, feasting together, and while they feasted, they built. The construction work probably happened during these same seasonal gatherings. This is when you had the labour force. This is when you had the surplus food to support workers who were spending their time quarrying and carving and moving stones. Instead of hunting and gathering, this is when you had the social energy, the collective commitment, the ritual context that made the enormous effort meaningful. But here's the thing that changes everything. These weren't farmers. The evidence is unambiguous. No domesticated animals in the early layers. The gazelle are wild, showing no morphological changes associated with domestication. The aurochs are wild, massive, dangerous beasts, not the smaller, more docile cattle that would emerge from domestication programs. The pigs are wild boar, not domestic pigs. The sheep and goats are wild, living in mountainous terrain, not penned near settlements. The botanical evidence from the earliest layers tells the same story. No domesticated plants. The seeds found at Göbekli Tepe are from wild species. Wild einkorn wheat, yes, growing abundantly in the region, but showing no morphological changes indicating cultivation. Wild barley, same story. Wild legumes, wild fruits, wild nuts. Your ancestors were gathering wild plants using the same strategies humans had used for hundreds of thousands of years. This is the revolutionary discovery that rewrote prehistory. Göbekli Tepe wasn't built by farmers. It was built by hunter-gatherers, by people who were still fully mobile, still relying entirely on wild resources, still living the way humans had lived since the beginning. But they were hunter-gatherers at the absolute peak of their capabilities, people who had mastered their environment so thoroughly that they could generate the surplus time and energy needed for monumental construction without ever planting a single crop. The region they lived in made this possible. Southeastern Turkey around 11,600 years ago was a hunter-gatherer paradise. The climate was warm and relatively wet, warmer and wetter than today. Rainfall was 20 to 30% higher than modern levels, supporting vegetation that has since disappeared. The landscape wasn't the dry, semi-arid steppe you see today. It was park-like woodland, open oak forests interspersed with grasslands, streams and seasonal wetlands. Wild cereal grasses grew in vast stands. Wild einkorn wheat covered entire hillsides. A family could gather a year's supply of grain in a few weeks of intensive harvesting. The grains could be stored, processed as needed, providing reliable calories throughout the year. Nut trees were abundant. Pistachios, almonds, acorns. Fruit trees grew wild. These weren't marginal resources. This was abundance. Herds of gazelle migrated through in numbers that are hard to imagine today. Historical accounts from the early 20th century, before modern hunting and habitat destruction, describe gazelle herds in the Middle East, numbering in the thousands, darkening the landscape like moving carpets. Your ancestors in 9600 BCE probably witnessed herds even larger. The carrying capacity of the landscape was higher, with better rainfall and vegetation. Wild cattle grazed the valleys. Archaeological evidence and historical accounts suggest that aurochs were relatively common in forested regions. They were dangerous, yes, but also predictable, following established patterns, using the same water sources, grazing the same rich meadows. A band that knew the landscape intimately knew where to find aurochs and when. Wild boar rooted in the oak forests, feeding on acorns and roots. Archaeological sites from this period across the Fertile Crescent show wild boar as an important food source. They were easier to hunt than gazelle or aurochs, more predictable, providing rich fatty meat. Your ancestors in this region didn't face the marginal existence of later hunter-gatherers, pushed into deserts or Arctic zones or other regions where farming had displaced foraging societies. They lived in optimal conditions. A skilled hunter could bring down enough meat in a few days to feed his family for weeks. Wild cereals were so plentiful that gathering them took minimal time compared to farming. This abundance created something unprecedented in human history. Sustained surplus. Not occasional surplus when everything went right. Not temporary surplus during good seasons, but reliable, predictable surplus year after year. Enough surplus that people could afford to invest time in activities that didn't directly contribute to food acquisition, like carving pillars, like organizing massive gatherings, like building temples. But surplus alone doesn't explain Göbekli Tepe. Plenty of hunter-gatherer societies throughout history had seasonal surplus. What made this different was what they chose to do with that surplus. Instead of just feasting and moving on, instead of using surplus time for leisure or tool maintenance or social activities, they invested it in something permanent, something that would outlast them, something that required returning year after year, generation after generation to maintain and expand. The motivation had to be powerful. Building these structures required immense effort. Quarrying 20-ton stones, carving elaborate reliefs with stone tools for hundreds of hours, organising hundreds of workers, moving massive pillars, erecting them without modern equipment. This wasn't fun. It wasn't easy. It was hard, dangerous, exhausting work. From a pure survival standpoint, it was a massive waste of resources. Those thousands of hours spent quarrying and carving could have been spent hunting, gathering, making tools, building shelters, storing food for winter. The energy expenditure was enormous. The caloric cost of moving a 20-ton stone probably equals the caloric content of several gazelle. From a strict cost-benefit analysis, building Göbekli Tepe made no sense, so why do it? The only answer that makes sense is ritual, religion, sacred duty. The belief that building these structures was necessary, not for material survival, but for spiritual survival. That these pillars and circles connected the human world with something beyond it, something powerful, something that demanded tribute in the form of monumental construction. Your ancestors came together to participate in ceremonies we can only dimly reconstruct, to perform rituals involving those carved animals, those anthropomorphic pillars, those circular spaces designed for gathering and witnessing, to maintain relationships with ancestors or spirits or gods whose names we'll never know, to mark territory as sacred, to create axis mundi, world navels, points where earth and sky and underworld met, where communication with the beyond became possible. And the remarkable thing, the thing that completely undermines our assumptions about hunter-gatherer religion, is that these rituals were sophisticated enough, important enough, powerful enough to mobilize hundreds of people across a wide region for sustained collective effort. This wasn't shamanic practice confined to individual bands. This was organized religion on a scale that created social complexity rivaling anything that would emerge from agricultural societies. Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist who excavated Göbekli Tepe, had a provocative thesis. He argued that this ritual activity, this need to gather and feast and build and celebrate, created pressures that eventually drove one of the most important transitions in human history. The need to support regular gatherings at Göbekli Tepe, to feed the builders, to supply the feasts, to ensure that people could return year after year without depleting resources. That's what pushed people to experiment with managing wild plant populations. They started doing things like protecting stands of wild wheat from grazing animals, clearing competing vegetation to give the wheat more room, scattering seeds in favourable locations to extend the distribution of useful plants, returning to the same locations year after year to harvest, which created selective pressure for plants with characteristics favourable to humans, seeds that didn't shatter immediately upon ripening, making them easier to collect, seeds that germinated more reliably, larger seeds with more nutrition. Over centuries, these small interventions accumulated, the plants responded, and gradually, without anyone planning it, without anyone understanding what was happening, wild plants were becoming domesticated. Morphological changes appeared, genetic changes accumulated. By 10,000 BCE, just 500 to 600 years after Göbekli Tepe's construction began, clear evidence of domesticated wheat and barley starts appearing in the archaeological record. This changes everything about how we understand the agricultural revolution. The conventional narrative said, first farming, then surplus, then leisure time, then religion, then monuments. A logical progression where each step enabled the next. Material needs first, spiritual needs later. Economics driving culture, bottom-up causation. Göbekli Tepe inverts that completely. First the monument, first the ritual, first the gathering, first the feast, and then, because people needed to support those gatherings, because the social and religious importance of these seasonal meets was so great, they developed farming. Not because anyone thought farming was a good idea in itself, but because it was necessary to sustain the ritual complex that had become central to their identity and worldview. Spiritual needs first, material needs following, culture driving economics, top-down causation. Your ancestors didn't become civilized because farming gave them surplus resources. They developed farming because their civilization, their ritual life, their need to gather and build and create sacred space, demanded it. We didn't discover agriculture and then build temples. We built temples and then, to maintain them, we discovered agriculture. The botanical evidence supports this timeline. In the later layers of Göbekli Tepe, starting around 10,000 to 9500 BCE, domesticated plants begin appearing in significant quantities. Wheat with larger grains and thinner hulls, morphological markers of domestication. Barley showing similar changes, legumes that had been cultivated. The people gathering here had started farming, not because they suddenly got the idea, but because the demands of maintaining this ritual complex required more reliable, more abundant food sources than wild collection alone could provide. And this pattern wasn't unique to Göbekli Tepe. Across the northern Fertile Crescent, the archaeological record shows the same sequence. Ritual architecture appears first or simultaneously with the earliest evidence of plant cultivation. The two processes are intertwined, each driving the other, creating a feedback loop that would ultimately transform human society more profoundly than any other change in our history. Think about what this reveals about human nature. We are not primarily economic animals who develop religion as an afterthought once our bellies are full. We are meaning-making animals who will reshape our entire way of life, even our food production systems, even our relationship with nature itself, to serve our spiritual and social needs. The drive to create sacred space, to gather in ritual communion, to build something permanent that connects us to forces beyond daily survival. That drive is so powerful it literally changed how humans feed themselves. This wasn't a settlement that built a temple. It was a temple that eventually created settlement. By 8000 BCE, permanent structures start appearing around Göbekli Tepe, not elaborate ones initially, just small rectangular buildings, probably housing for people who maintain the site between seasonal gatherings, storage facilities for tools and supplies, infrastructure supporting the ritual complex. Settlement emerged not because people decided settled life was inherently desirable, but because the temple required year-round maintenance. Someone had to stay to repair damage from winter storms, to keep the site clear of debris, to prepare for the next gathering, to protect the sacred space from animals and erosion. And once you have people staying year-round, even just a few families, you have the beginning of permanent settlement. The implications ripple outward. Göbekli Tepe wasn't alone. It was the epicenter of something much larger, a cultural revolution that spread across the entire Fertile Crescent, a civilization based on ritual and shared sacred spaces that existed before and independently of agriculture. And understanding that civilization, understanding how widespread it was and how it worked, that's the next part of the story, because what happened at this one hilltop was actually part of a network that stretched across thousands of square miles and transformed human society forever. About 15 miles from Göbekli Tepe, there's another site, Karahan Tepe, discovered in 1997, just 2 years after excavations began at Göbekli Tepe. Then Harbutsuvan Tepesi, found in 2000, then Sefer Tepe, then Taş Tepeler, which means stone hills in Turkish, now used as a collective name for the entire group. Then more sites identified through survey and remote sensing. At least a dozen similar complexes discovered so far, spread across what's now southeastern Turkey and northern Syria, covering an area of roughly 200 by 150 kilometers, all built around the same time, within a few centuries of each other, all featuring similar T-shaped pillars, though varying in size and elaboration, all created by pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers who shared a common symbolic language and ritual tradition. Göbekli Tepe wasn't an isolated miracle. It was the epicenter of something much larger, a cultural sphere that extended across thousands of square miles, a civilization, if we can call it that, though not like any civilization we'd previously identified. No cities, no writing, no kings, no temples with resident priests, but a civilization nonetheless in the sense of shared culture, common beliefs, coordinated effort, and sustained social complexity across multiple generations. The similarities between these sites are striking and can't be explained by coincidence. T-shaped pillars always. This isn't just a convenient building technique, it's a specific symbolic form repeated across the entire region. The T-shape appears at every site in various sizes, from small pillars less than 3 feet tall to massive ones over 18 feet. The form is consistent, rectangular shaft, perpendicular crossbar, proportions maintained across scale variations. Circular enclosures usually, though some sites have rectangular spaces. The circular form dominates, suggesting it held particular meaning. Circles have symbolic power in many cultures, representing cycles, wholeness, perfection, the movement of celestial bodies. Your ancestors chose this form deliberately, maintained it across multiple sites, made it central to their sacred architecture. Animal carvings appear frequently, though the specific animals vary by site. Some creatures appear everywhere: snakes, foxes, scorpions, vultures. Others are site-specific. This variation suggests local identity within shared tradition, different groups emphasizing different aspects of a common cosmology. Karahan Tepe has at least 250 T-shaped pillars identified so far through survey, though only a small portion has been excavated. Many pillars are still buried, visible only through ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry. Some exposed pillars show elaborate carving, including three-dimensional anthropomorphic figures carved in high relief, more explicit human representations than at Göbekli Tepe. One pillar features a human figure with arms raised, possibly in worship or supplication. The site also has unusual architectural features not found at Göbekli Tepe. Underground chambers carved into bedrock, accessed through narrow shafts. Bench-like platforms with human figures carved in relief, reclining or seated. Water channels cut into stone floors. The function of these features is debated. Ritual baths, offerings, practical water management? We don't know, but the sophistication is undeniable. Habasuvan Tepesi, smaller than Göbekli Tepe or Karahan Tepe, has a distinct character. More geometric patterns, less naturalistic animal carving. Abstract symbols that might represent constellations, might encode astronomical knowledge, might be purely decorative, or might mean something we haven't yet understood. Array-shaped figures, cross patterns, chevrons, parallel lines. These appear carved on pillars and on stone slabs incorporated into walls. Sefer Tepe has structures partially destroyed by later agricultural activity, ancient ploughing and modern farming having damaged the remains. But enough survives to show T-shaped pillars and circular arrangements consistent with the broader pattern. Excavation is limited, but survey work indicates multiple structures across a 2-hectare area. Newer discoveries continue emerging. In 2021, excavations began at Saburs, where a building containing a carved frieze depicting human figures was discovered. The carving shows a person being threatened by animals, possibly a hunting scene or a symbolic representation of human-nature relationships. The style is consistent with Göbekli Tepe, but with unique iconographic elements. Each site has its own character, its own emphasis, its own variations on the common themes, but they're unmistakably related. The symbolic language is shared, the architectural vocabulary is consistent, the construction techniques show common knowledge. These weren't independent inventions, they were connected, part of a network of sites sharing information, beliefs, and practices. Think about what this requires. Communication between groups separated by dozens of miles. Regular contact to maintain consistency of symbolic meanings. Transmission of construction knowledge, how to quarry stones, how to carve reliefs, how to erect pillars, how to create stable circular structures. This knowledge had to be preserved and taught across generations, implying specialists who understood the techniques and could teach others. Some archaeologists argue this required a class of ritual specialists, proto-priests who travelled between sites, maintaining traditions, directing ceremonies, ensuring that the symbolic language remained consistent. These individuals might not have been priests in the later sense of permanent religious officials attached to specific temples, but they were specialists nonetheless, people whose role was to preserve and transmit ritual knowledge, to organize gatherings, to coordinate construction, to maintain the sacred. Evidence for such specialists is indirect but suggestive. The consistency of iconography across sites implies teaching and transmission that's more systematic than casual contact. The complexity of the construction techniques implies master builders who understood engineering principles and could direct labour. The sustained nature of construction over centuries implies organisational continuity, knowledge passing from generation to generation with minimal loss. The distribution of these sites is revealing. They cluster in the northern Fertile Crescent, exactly the region where agriculture would first develop, exactly the zone with the highest diversity of wild cereals and other founder crops, exactly the area with optimal conditions for both intensive foraging and eventual cultivation. This isn't coincidence. The same environmental abundance that made monumental construction possible was the abundance that would eventually favour plant domestication. But the Cultural Revolution came first. Your ancestors in this region developed complex society, organised religion, monumental architecture, specialised knowledge, and sustained social coordination before they planted their first crops. They achieved what we thought required agriculture without agriculture. They organised themselves at a scale we thought required settlement without settlement. They created a civilization without cities, and that civilization required serious social complexity beyond what hunter-gatherer models predicted. Building one temple is impressive. Building a network of temples across thousands of square miles, maintaining them for over a millennium, keeping the symbolic language consistent, coordinating gatherings that might draw people from hundreds of miles away. All of this requires organisation that anthropologists didn't think was possible without agriculture and sedentism. Information had to flow between groups, news of gatherings had to spread, schedules had to be coordinated, labour had to be organised, resources had to be managed, conflicts had to be resolved, all the challenges that we associate with complex societies had to be addressed. How did they do it without kings, without bureaucrats, without written records, without any of the infrastructure we think is necessary for social complexity? We don't know for certain, but the archaeological evidence offers clues. The feasting remains suggest large gatherings were the mechanism for social coordination. When hundreds of people came together, that's when decisions could be made, when information could be shared, when disputes could be arbitrated, when knowledge could be transmitted. The ritual context probably provided the framework. Sacred obligations, shared beliefs, ritual calendars dictating when gatherings occurred. Leadership was probably situational and achievement-based rather than permanent and hereditary. The person who could organise the best feast gained prestige. The person who knew the most about construction techniques directed building projects. The person who understood ritual best led ceremonies. But these roles didn't necessarily translate into permanent power. Once the gathering ended, everyone dispersed back to their normal bands, resuming mobile foraging until the next seasonal meet. This pattern, seasonal aggregation and dispersal, is known from ethnographic studies of hunter-gatherers in favourable environments. Australian Aboriginal groups had ceremonial gatherings drawing multiple bands together for weeks at a time. Northwestern coast Native Americans had potlatches involving hundreds of people. The difference is scale and permanence. Those ethnographic examples didn't leave monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites did. The construction itself may have been the point as much as the finished product. The act of coming together, of working collectively toward a shared goal, of creating something permanent that embodied shared beliefs, that may have been what mattered most. The pillars were witnesses to that cooperation, symbols of collective effort, markers of identity for the groups that built them, and this network of ritual sites represents something unprecedented in human evolution. The first time humans organised themselves around shared abstract beliefs, rather than just shared survival needs. The first time ideas, rather than genetics or territory, defined a community. The first time humans created cultural institutions designed to persist beyond individual lifetimes. Your ancestors were building tradition, making culture something solid and permanent, creating social memory encoded in stone. This was the beginning of what we might call civilization, though not in the way we usually use that term. No urban centres, no state organisation, no written records. But civilization in the sense of sustained social complexity, coordinated effort across large territories, shared symbolic systems maintained over centuries, cultural evolution accelerating beyond biological evolution. These were civilized people in every sense that matters. They had art, architecture, religion, organisation, tradition, and the ability to work together toward goals that transcended immediate survival. The cultural revolution they created would eventually drive material changes. The need to support these gathering sites, to feed the participants, to ensure people could return year after year, created incentives for managing resources more intensively, protecting stands of wild wheat near the sites, increasing yields through selective harvesting, eventually cultivation, and once cultivation began, once people started farming, the entire social system would transform again. But we're getting ahead of the story, because after maintaining these sites for over a millennium, after making them central to their identity and worldview, after investing countless generations in construction and ritual, your ancestors did something that's almost as mysterious as the building itself. They walked away. Or rather, they carefully, deliberately, reverently buried everything they'd created and moved on to a fundamentally different way of life. Here's what happened next and why it changes our entire understanding not just of Göbekli Tepe, but of human nature and the agricultural revolution. Around 8000 BCE, after maintaining Göbekli Tepe for over 100 years, after 36 generations had contributed to its construction and ritual life, after it had become woven into the cultural fabric of every group in the region, the people who built it made a collective decision. They didn't abandon it casually. They didn't let it decay through neglect. They didn't destroy it in some cataclysmic event or violent rejection of the old ways. They deliberately, systematically, carefully filled in the entire complex. Thousands of tons of earth and limestone rubble, carried in basket by basket, packed down over and around the pillars, burying the carvings, covering the circles, concealing the sacred spaces they'd spent centuries creating. The effort required to bury Göbekli Tepe probably matched the effort required to build it in the first place. It would have taken decades, maybe generations, to complete. They turned their temple into a hill, and then, as far as we can tell from the archaeological record, they left and never returned. The evidence for intentional burial is unambiguous and remarkable in its consistency. The fill layers show clear signs of deliberate deposition, not natural accumulation. When sites decay naturally, soil accumulates gradually through wind-blown dust, decomposing vegetation, erosion from surrounding areas. The layers are thin, irregular, mixed with cultural debris scattered randomly. Natural fills show bioturbation, disturbance from plant roots and burrowing animals. They contain artifacts in all orientations jumbled by natural processes. The fill at Göbekli Tepe is different. It's homogeneous within each layer, showing consistent composition and packing. The layers are thick, meters deep in places, far more than could accumulate naturally over the time period involved. The material comes from nearby sources, soil and limestone rubble from the immediate area, suggesting organized collection and transport. Most tellingly, the fill contains special deposits, intentionally placed objects that seem meaningful, offerings or ritual closures or symbolic statements about what was being buried. These special deposits include broken stone tools, particularly flint and obsidian blades that show signs of use but were deliberately broken before being placed in the fill. Archaeologists can distinguish accidental breakage from intentional. Accidental breaks show characteristic patterns, impact fractures, stress breaks, use-wear damage. Intentional breaks are different. Clean snaps perpendicular to the long axis, multiple breaks creating fragments, patterns suggesting ritual destruction. Animal bones appear in the fill, not random trash but specific species and specific elements. Gazelle skulls, aurochs horn cores, fox jawbones. The selection seems meaningful, perhaps representing important species from the carved iconography, perhaps symbolizing the wild nature being left behind as agriculture developed. Stone bowls, carefully carved limestone vessels, some intact but most deliberately broken, fragments placed in the fill. These bowls were valuable objects requiring hours of work to create. Breaking and burying them wasn't casual disposal, it was intentional sacrifice, giving up something valuable as part of the closure ritual. The pillars themselves show no signs of damage before burial. This is crucial, they weren't toppled by earthquakes. Göbekli Tepe sits in a seismically active zone, and earthquakes certainly occurred during the site's 500-year use period. But the pillars show no earthquake damage, no cracking or tilting or collapse that would be expected if they'd been subjected to strong seismic shaking while standing exposed. They weren't smashed by invaders, no burn layers indicating destruction, no scattered artifacts suggesting looting, no evidence of violence or hostile takeover. Comparative examples from later periods show clear signatures when sites are destroyed by conquest, bodies left unburied, destruction layers with ash and debris, valuable objects smashed but not removed. Göbekli Tepe has none of this. They weren't weathered by centuries of neglect. Exposed limestone weathers at predictable rates. Rain dissolves surface calcium carbonate. Wind abrasion creates characteristic patterns. Temperature cycling causes surface spalling. Over centuries, carved details blur and disappear. But when archaeologists removed the fill and exposed the pillars, the carvings were still sharp, fine detail still visible, surface features still clear. The pillars were standing intact, carefully maintained when burial began. Think about what this means. Someone was still taking care of these structures right up until the moment they were deliberately concealed, still repairing damage, still keeping the spaces clear, still using them for ritual purposes, and then, at some point, a decision was made, a collective decision involving multiple groups across the region. Stop using the sites, fill them in, move on. The timing is significant and probably not coincidental. 8000 BCE marks a major transition period in the Fertile Crescent, a hinge point in human history when everything was changing. This is when agriculture really takes off, when domesticated plants start appearing in substantial quantities across multiple sites, when the transition from foraging to farming becomes irreversible. Wild einkorn wheat and barley are replaced by morphologically distinct domesticated varieties. Settlement patterns shift from seasonal camps to permanent villages. The archaeological record transforms fundamentally. Around 8000 BCE, sites like Sayonu and Kafahuyuk in southeastern Turkey show clear evidence of agricultural economies, domesticated wheat and barley storage facilities, permanent rectangular buildings arranged in village layouts, specialized structures that might be shrines or communal buildings but within settlements, not isolated on hilltops. The social organization is changing, the worldview is shifting, the relationship with nature is being transformed. Klaus Schmidt, who spent 18 years excavating Göbekli Tepe, developed a theory about the burial. He argued it represented ritual closure, a conscious decision to end one phase of existence and begin another. The hunter-gatherer world, with its emphasis on wild nature, animal spirits, seasonal mobility, and communal ritual sites, was ending. The agricultural world, with its emphasis on domestication, control, permanent settlement, and sedentary life, was beginning. Burying Göbekli Tepe was a way of respectfully closing the door on the old world while stepping into the new one. This wasn't rejection or desecration. It was something closer to a funeral. Your ancestors were burying their past, their traditions, their sacred spaces with care and honour. The massive investment of labour required to fill in the structures shows this wasn't casual. They could have just walked away. The climate was stable enough that abandonment wouldn't immediately destroy the pillars. Within a century or two, yes, weathering would have taken its toll, but if all they wanted was to stop using the site, abandonment would have been far easier than burial. Instead, they chose burial, which required organising labour, gathering fill material, transporting it to the site, packing it down carefully, including special objects as offerings or symbolic statements. This level of effort suggests the burial itself was ritualistic, meaningful, an important act rather than just practical site closure. Other archaeologists have proposed alternative interpretations, and the debates continue in academic literature. Some argue that environmental changes made the sites less feasible to maintain. The climate was continuing to warm and dry throughout the early Holocene. The oak forests that had provided abundant wild resources were shifting their ranges northward and upward in elevation. The gazelle herds were changing their migration patterns in response to changing vegetation. The ideal conditions that had made Göbekli Tepe possible in 9600 BCE might have deteriorated by 8000 BCE. If the seasonal abundance that supported the gatherings was declining, if it was becoming harder to feed hundreds of people during construction periods, if the logistics of maintaining these remote hilltop sites was becoming more difficult, practical considerations might have driven the burial decision. Better to close the sites respectfully while resources still allowed for proper closure than to abandon them when maintaining them became impossible. Another interpretation focuses on social and political changes. Maybe new groups moved into the region with different beliefs, different priorities, different sacred sites. Maybe internal conflicts arose between traditionalists who wanted to maintain the old ritual sites and reformers who wanted to embrace agricultural life fully and create new religious institutions within settlements. Maybe the burial was a compromise, preserving the sacred nature of the old sites while acknowledging that their active use was ending. Some researchers point to changes in symbolic representation around this time. The animal-focused iconography at Göbekli Tepe, emphasizing wild, dangerous creatures, gives way in later agricultural sites to more anthropocentric art. Human figures become more common. Domestic animals start appearing in iconography. The shift from wild to domestic, from nature-centered to human-centered, appears in material culture and might reflect changing worldviews. The burial could represent this transition, the old gods, the animal spirits, the forces of wild nature that your hunter-gatherer ancestors revered, being respectfully but firmly set aside as agriculture required a new relationship with nature. Farmers can't revere wild nature in the same way foragers do. Farming is about controlling nature, domesticating it, bending it to human will. The reverence for wild predators, for dangerous snakes and scorpions, for the untamed power embodied in the Göbekli Tepe carvings that becomes incompatible with an agricultural worldview. Think about what this reveals about their worldview and their values. They could have just walked away, letting the structures decay naturally. They could have destroyed them if they represented beliefs being rejected. They could have dismantled them and reused the stones, which would have been practical since carved limestone blocks would have been valuable building material for the emerging villages. Instead, they buried them carefully, completely, in a way that preserved everything. This suggests respect, even reverence for what the sites represented, even as people moved beyond them. This is sophisticated cultural behavior showing complex thinking about past and future, tradition and change, honoring heritage while embracing transformation. The burial also connects to broader patterns in early agricultural societies. As people transitioned to farming, as they committed to permanent settlements and domestic plants and animals, their relationship with the wild changed fundamentally. Hunter-gatherers see themselves as part of nature, embedded in the web of relationships between predators and prey, seasons and migrations, part of the ecosystem rather than separate from it. Farmers see themselves as separate from nature, controllers of nature, managers directing natural processes for human benefit. The wild becomes other, something outside the human domain, something to be tamed or excluded. The psychological shift is profound. Nature stops being sacred and becomes a resource. Animals stop being spiritual kin and become property. Plants stop being gifts and become products. Göbekli Tepe represents the hunter-gatherer worldview in its most elaborate form. Those carvings of wild animals, those depictions of predators and dangerous creatures, those astronomical alignments connecting earthly structures to celestial patterns, all of it embodies a cosmology where humans are participants in nature, not masters of it, where power belongs to wild forces that must be respected and propitiated through ritual. Burying that worldview, literally covering it with earth, sealing it away, might have been necessary psychologically for people making the transition to agriculture. You can't farm successfully while maintaining full reverence for wild nature. Farming requires destroying wild ecosystems, clearing land, eliminating competing plants and animals, imposing human order on natural chaos. The mental shift required is profound. But your ancestors didn't destroy their temple. They didn't desecrate it or reject it violently. They buried it carefully, preserved it perfectly, treated it with the honor due to something sacred even as they moved beyond it. This is mature cultural behavior showing psychological sophistication we don't usually credit to Neolithic peoples. And here's where it gets really profound. This wasn't just one site being buried. Archaeological evidence suggests other ritual complexes in the network were being deliberately filled and closed around the same time. Karahan Tepe shows similar patterns of intentional fill-in layers dated to roughly 8,000 BCE. Other sites in the Tash Tepela group show evidence of ritual closure in the same period. This was a regional phenomenon, a widespread transformation, multiple communities making similar decisions around the same time. This wasn't one group acting alone. This was coordinated cultural change across the entire region. The civilization that had built these sites, that had maintained them for over a millennium, collectively decided to end that phase of existence and begin something new. The agricultural world that replaced it was different in every way. Instead of seasonal gatherings at remote hilltop sites, rituals moved into settlements integrated into daily, village life. Instead of mobile bands, fixed communities with permanent social relationships and emerging hierarchy. Instead of wild resources, domestic plants and animals requiring constant labor and attention. Instead of egalitarian social structures, increasingly stratified ones as some people controlled more resources than others. Instead of ritual specialists who traveled between sites, priests who resided in temples within settlements and wielded permanent authority. Everything changed. The world your hunter-gatherer ancestors had known, the world they'd built Göbekli Tepe to celebrate and sanctify, that world was ending. and they knew it. They recognized the transition and marked it with elaborate ritual closure. They honored their past even as they stepped into a radically different future. But by burying Göbekli Tepe so carefully, by protecting those pillars with meters of fill, your ancestors created an accidental time capsule. The burial that marked the end of one era ensured that evidence of that era would survive for 10,000 years. Without that burial, the structures probably wouldn't have survived. The stones would have been quarried for later building projects. The pillars would have been toppled by ploughing. The carvings would have weathered away. Göbekli Tepe would have been lost, its story untold, its revolutionary implications unknown. The deliberate act of ending the site is paradoxically what allowed it to survive long enough to tell us its story. The people who buried it couldn't have known this would happen. They weren't thinking about future archaeologists. They were marking a transition in their own lives, closing a chapter in their own history. But the result was preservation that lets us, 10,000 years later, understand our past in ways we never could have otherwise. And that story stayed buried, literally and figuratively, for 10,000 years. The site became just another hill, nothing obviously special about it, maybe locally known but not understood. Generations of farmers worked the fields around it, never knowing what lay beneath. And then, in 1994, someone decided to take a closer look. About 30 years ago, or more precisely in October 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was sitting in an office in Berlin, reviewing old archaeological survey reports from southeastern Turkey. He was part of the German Archaeological Institute, one of the world's premier archaeological research organizations, with excavation projects scattered across the Mediterranean and Near East. Schmidt had spent years working on Neolithic sites in the region, had excavated at Nevalachori, another early site about 20 miles from Göbekli Tepe, where similar T-shaped pillars had been found in the 1980s before the site was flooded by dam construction. He'd heard about a hill called Göbekli Tepe that had been surveyed in the 1960s by Peter Benedict, an American archaeologist conducting regional surveys. Benedict had noted the hill as archaeologically interesting, mentioned some limestone slabs visible on the surface, suggested it might be a Byzantine or medieval cemetery. Locals called it Potbelly Hill because of its rounded shape. Nothing obviously special, just another of thousands of tells and ruins scattered across Anatolia, layer upon layer of human occupation going back millennia. But something in the survey description caught Schmidt's attention. The mention of limestone slabs, the hilltop location, the size of the site. He'd seen similar descriptions elsewhere, and his experience at Nevalachori had taught him what T-shaped pillars looked like, how they appeared in the archaeological record, how easy it was to mistake them for natural limestone formations or later grave markers if you weren't looking carefully. Schmidt decided it was worth a visit. In fall 1994, he drove out to this remote hilltop in the middle of nowhere, kilometers from the nearest village, accessible only by rough roads. The hill rose about 50 feet above the surrounding plain, commanding views in all directions. Agricultural fields surrounded it. Farmers had been ploughing here for centuries, maybe millennia. If anything important was here, it should have been found long ago. He climbed to the top and started walking, looking at the stones, picking up pottery fragments from the surface, examining the topography, and within minutes, probably within seconds of close examination, he knew. This wasn't a medieval cemetery. The stones weren't random grave markers. They were something much older, much bigger, much more important. The first clue was the stones visible on the surface. They weren't randomly shaped. They were carefully worked limestone, some with traces of carving still visible, despite centuries of weathering. They weren't oriented randomly. They seemed to be aligned, suggesting buried structures. They weren't isolated. They extended across a large area of the hilltop. The second clue was the pottery. The fragments Schmidt picked up weren't medieval. They weren't even Bronze Age or Chalcolithic. They were Neolithic, pre-pottery Neolithic specifically, among the oldest ceramics ever found in the region, from a period when pottery was just being invented. This was 9,000 to 10,000 years old. The third clue was the hill itself. It wasn't entirely natural. The shape was too regular, too rounded, too artificially looking. This was a tell, an accumulated settlement mound, except the stones suggested it wasn't a settlement. Settlements don't have massive carved limestone monuments. Settlements have houses, streets, trash pits. the ordinary detritus of daily life. Schmidt recognized immediately that this might be another ritual site like REWROTE, possibly contemporary, possibly even larger. And if it was larger and better preserved, if it hadn't been destroyed by dam construction like REWROTE, this could be the most important Neolithic site in Anatolia, maybe in the entire Near East. He returned to Berlin and began organizing excavations, securing permits from Turkish authorities, which took time and patience and diplomatic skill, finding funding, which required convincing granting agencies that this remote hilltop was worth investing in, assembling a team, recruiting specialists in various fields, planning logistics for working in a remote location far from modern amenities. Test excavations began in 1995, small trenches, just enough to confirm what Schmidt suspected. What they found exceeded expectations. Not just a ritual site, not just T-shaped pillars, but massive pillars, elaborately carved, arranged in complex circular structures dating to the absolute earliest Neolithic period, Pre-Pottery Neolithic A, roughly 9600 to 9000 BCE, over 11,000 years old. The first structure they excavated, Enclosure A, revealed pillars 15 feet tall covered with carved animals. The artistic quality was stunning, the preservation was miraculous, and the implications were immediately obvious. This predated everything. This was older than agriculture, older than permanent settlements, older than anything that was supposed to have monumental architecture. Schmidt began publishing preliminary reports in 1996 and 1997, presenting his findings at conferences, arguing for the site's revolutionary importance. The initial response from the archaeological community was skeptical. The dates must be wrong. The structures must be later additions. The sophisticated carvings couldn't be pre-pottery Neolithic. Human societies at that time simply weren't capable of this level of organization and artistic achievement. But Schmidt kept excavating, and the evidence kept confirming the initial interpretations. Radiocarbon dating on organic material from the fill layers, animal bones and charcoal from fires, consistently returned dates between 9600 and 8000 BCE. Obsidian hydration dating on the stone tools gave compatible results. Stratigraphic analysis showed clear sequences with the structures built, used, and then deliberately buried before any agricultural materials appeared. Every independent line of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. These structures were built around 9600 BCE by pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers, maintained for 1,500 years, and buried around 8000 BCE. The excavations became major field seasons involving dozens of workers. Local villagers were employed, providing labour and learning archaeological techniques. Specialists came from universities across Europe and Turkey. Photographers, surveyors, conservators, zooarchaeologists, archaeobotanists, geoarchaeologists, all contributing expertise. Each season revealed new structures, new pillars, new carvings. Enclosure B with its H-shaped symbols and geometric patterns. Enclosure C with its aurochs carvings and massive central pillars. Enclosure D, eventually the most completely excavated, with its 12 peripheral pillars and 2 central pillars 18 feet tall, covered with the most elaborate animal carvings found anywhere at the site. Every discovery generated more questions. Why were some animals depicted and others absent? What did the H-shaped symbols mean? Were the astronomical alignments intentional? What rituals occurred in these spaces? How many people attended gatherings? Where did they come from? How was labour organised? What social structures made this possible? Schmidt became an evangelist for the site, travelling constantly to give lectures and presentations. He published popular articles arguing that Göbekli Tepe required rethinking the Neolithic revolution. Religion didn't follow agriculture. Religion came first, creating the conditions that made agriculture necessary. The temple built the settlement, not vice versa. Everything historians had been teaching about this period needed revision. Some colleagues embraced his interpretations enthusiastically. Others remained more cautious. Academic debates filled journals and conference sessions. Was it really a temple? Could it have had practical functions like observatories or gathering places for social bonding without primarily ritual purposes? Were the dates absolutely secure? Could some structures be later than currently believed? This is how science works, through debate and continued investigation, skepticism and evidence, gradually building toward consensus. But the basic facts remained undeniable, and kept being confirmed by additional excavation and analysis. This was an extraordinary site from an extraordinarily early period, demonstrating capabilities and organizational complexity that hunter-gatherers supposedly didn't possess. Schmidt continued directing excavations year after year, every summer returning to this hilltop that had become his life's work. He was there in 2000 when they excavated the spectacular lion pillar in Enclosure D, carved with multiple large predators. There in 2003 when new enclosures were identified through geophysical survey. There in 2010 when they found pillars with human heads carved in relief. Every season brought new discoveries, new insights, new evidence that these people were more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. He worked with conservation specialists to protect the exposed pillars from weathering. Once the fill was removed, the limestone that had been protected for 10,000 years was suddenly exposed to sun, wind, rain, temperature fluctuations. The stone began to deteriorate immediately. Carvings started losing detail. Surface spalling began. Emergency conservation was needed. A massive shelter was built, steel frame supporting fabric roof covering the main excavation areas. It looks incongruous, this modern structure sheltering ancient stones, like a circus tent over a sacred site. But it's necessary to preserve what remains. Without protection, the pillars that survived 10,000 years buried would deteriorate to nubs within decades exposed. Schmidt also dealt with increasing tourism. As word spread about Göbekli Tepe, visitors started coming, first dozens, then hundreds, eventually tens of thousands per year. This brings money to the region, creates jobs, raises awareness about the site's importance. But it also creates conservation challenges. Foot traffic, touching, photography, all the tiny impacts that accumulate when masses of people visit fragile archaeological sites. Balancing preservation with access is an ongoing challenge. The site gained UNESCO World Heritage status in 2018, providing international protection and recognition. The Turkish government invested in visitor facilities, pathways, interpretive signs, a museum. Göbekli Tepe became a major archaeological destination, one of the most important prehistoric sites accessible to the public. But Klaus Schmidt didn't live to see the UNESCO designation. He died suddenly in July 2014 while swimming near the excavation site, apparently from a heart attack. He was 61 years old, at the height of his career, still actively excavating, still publishing, still fighting for recognition of Göbekli Tepe's importance. He devoted 18 years to the site, longer than some of the structures were in active use, longer than the builders probably lived. His death was a blow to the project and to Anatolian archaeology generally. He'd been the visionary, the one who recognized the site's significance when others had dismissed it as just another medieval cemetery, the one who had the persistence and political skill to secure funding and permits, the one who fought academic battles to establish Göbekli Tepe as a revolutionary site requiring complete rethinking of the Neolithic period. The project continued under new direction. Lee Clare, a colleague who'd worked with Schmidt for years, took over as field director. Excavations continue annually, using increasingly sophisticated techniques. Three-dimensional laser scanning documents every exposed surface, creating precise digital models that preserve data even as the physical site deteriorates. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry reveal buried structures without excavation, allowing planning and site protection. DNA analysis of organic residues found on stone tools and in deposits provides information about the people who built the site, though human remains are surprisingly rare. Isotope analysis of animal bones recovered from the site reveals information about ancient climate, vegetation, and animal migration patterns, reconstructing the environment your ancestors inhabited. Digital modelling attempts to reconstruct what the completed enclosures looked like. Most excavated structures are partially buried or damaged. Reconstruction requires careful analysis of what remains, understanding architectural principles, making educated guesses about missing elements. The resulting models suggest that completed enclosures were surrounded by stone walls up to 10 feet high, creating enclosed spaces with the pillars inside, roofed or open to the sky. Conservation continues, as a major concern. Those exposed pillars that Schmidt fought so hard to preserve are still deteriorating despite the shelter. Salt crystals form on surfaces, expanding and contracting with temperature and humidity changes, breaking away fragments. Biological growth, lichens and mosses slowly dissolve stone. The fight to preserve Göbekli Tepe for future generations is constant and expensive. New discoveries keep emerging, confirming Schmidt's prediction that future excavations would reveal things making current interpretations seem naive. In 2021, excavators uncovered a pillar with human heads carved in relief along its shaft. 3 heads arranged vertically, faces looking forward, individual features clearly visible, expressions captured in stone. This is now interpreted as representation of ancestral figures or revered elders, adding dimensions to our understanding of the symbolic program. Analysis of the burial fill continues revealing new information. Different layers contain different materials, suggesting the burial happened in stages, or that different groups contributed different offerings. Some layers are rich in animal bones, others contain mostly stone tools, others have unusual objects like stone balls or peculiar-shaped rocks whose purpose remains mysterious. The site's influence extends beyond archaeology into popular culture. Göbekli Tepe appears in documentaries, features in popular books about human origins, inspires novels and films. It has become a symbol of lost civilizations, ancient mysteries, forgotten knowledge. This popular attention is both blessing and curse. It generates interest and funding, but also attracts fringe theories and wild speculation that responsible archaeologists must constantly refute. But 95% of Göbekli Tepe remains unexcavated, still buried beneath those fields and hills, still waiting to be revealed. Geophysical surveys show anomalies across the entire hilltop and down the slopes. Probable structures, possible pillars, architectural features detected by magnetometry and ground-penetrating radar. There might be hundreds of pillars still underground, dozens more enclosures, carvings and symbols and architectural details we haven't seen yet, evidence that will continue refining and possibly revolutionizing our understanding. Schmidt used to say that every generation of archaeologists would find things at Göbekli Tepe that previous generations missed or misinterpreted. He was probably right. The site is so complex, so unprecedented, so outside our experience of what hunter-gatherers could do, that understanding it fully will take many more decades of excavation, analysis, and debate. The story that began when Schmidt walked up that hill in 1994 is still unfolding, still revealing implications we haven't fully processed, still challenging everything we thought we knew. Now, before you think this entire story is just about one impressive archaeological site, before you file this away as interesting, but ultimately just another ancient mystery solved, we need to talk about what Göbekli Tepe actually means for our understanding of humanity. Because the implications reach far beyond one temple complex in Turkey, far beyond settling academic debates about dating or debunking old theories about the Neolithic Revolution. They touch everything about how we understand ourselves, how we think about religion and where it comes from, how we understand the origins of agriculture and why humans decided to farm, how we define civilization itself and what makes us human, even how we conceive of human nature, what drives us, what motivates us, what we're capable of when properly inspired. The most immediate and dramatic impact has been on theories of agricultural origins. For over a century since people first started thinking scientifically about where agriculture came from, archaeologists and anthropologists worked with a clear materialist model. The story went something like this. Environmental or population pressure forced humans to intensify food production. Maybe climate change reduced natural resources. Maybe population growth meant there were too many mouths to feed through hunting and gathering. Maybe both. Whatever the cause, people had to find ways to get more food from the same territory. This led to experimentation with managing wild plant populations, protecting desirable species, gradually selecting for useful characteristics, eventually full domestication. Domestication created surplus for the first time in human history. Regular, reliable surplus. Surplus enabled permanent settlements because you could store food and didn't need to move seasonally. Settlements allowed specialization because not everyone needed to be directly involved in food production. Specialization created social complexity, some people becoming craftspeople, traders, leaders. Social complexity eventually produced religion and ritual as expressions of that complexity, ways of binding communities together, legitimizing hierarchy, explaining the world, and finally, once you had all that, once you had agriculture, surplus, settlement, specialization, complexity, and organized religion, then you could build monumental architecture. Temples, pyramids, ziggurats, the great structures we associate with early civilizations. It was a materialist explanation, one that put economic needs first and cultural development second. Food security drives everything. Religion and ritual and art and architecture are luxuries, superstructure built on top of the material base, epiphenomena emerging only after basic needs are met. This framework made intuitive sense. It matched our observations of how modern societies work. It fit with evolutionary theories about complexity emerging from simpler states. It was scientific, testable, supported by evidence from multiple archaeological sites. Göbekli Tepe inverts this model completely and demonstrates it's wrong in fundamental ways. Here's a ritual complex built before agriculture, before domestication, before permanent settlements, before any of the material conditions that were supposed to be prerequisites. The temple came first, the ritual came first, the cultural expression came first. And agriculture developed afterward, not as a natural progression from simple to complex, not as a random discovery that people adopted because it seemed like a good idea, but as a necessary response to cultural demands. The need to support regular gatherings at Göbekli Tepe, to feed participants in seasonal ritual events, to supply massive feasts accompanying construction projects, to ensure people could return year after year without depleting resources created incentives for managing plant populations more intensively. Your ancestors started protecting wild wheat and barley growing near the site, started clearing competing vegetation, started selecting seeds from the best plants, started creating conditions favourable for these useful species. Not because anyone planned to invent agriculture, but because the ritual gatherings they were committed to required more food than natural foraging alone could reliably provide. Over centuries, these small interventions accumulated. The plants responded evolutionarily. Natural selection favoured characteristics useful to humans: larger seeds, tougher rachis that didn't shatter immediately upon ripening, more reliable germination. Gradually, without anyone necessarily understanding what was happening, wild plants were becoming domesticated. Morphological changes appeared, genetic changes accumulated. By 10,000 BCE, just 500 to 600 years after Göbekli Tepe's construction began, domesticated wheat and barley were appearing in the archaeological record. This suggests that religion, ritual, the human need for meaning and connection to something beyond daily survival, might be a primary driver of social change, not a secondary consequence of economic development. We're not primarily economic animals who develop religion as an afterthought once our bellies are full. We're meaning-making animals who will reshape our entire way of life, even our food production systems, even our fundamental relationship with nature, to serve our ritual and spiritual needs. Think about what this implies for human nature. Your ancestors chose to invest thousands of hours building temples before they figured out how to farm. They committed to ritual gatherings that required enormous labour and resources without any guarantee of material payoff. They created sacred spaces and maintained them for over a millennium, prioritizing spiritual needs over economic efficiency. That reveals something profound about what motivates human behavior, about what we value, about what we're willing to sacrifice for. This has ripple effects across multiple academic disciplines. Anthropologists studying contemporary societies need to reconsider assumptions about the relationship between subsistence and culture, between material base and ideological superstructure. The old Marxist model that everything derives from economic relations, that culture is just a reflection of material conditions, that becomes untenable when you have culture clearly driving material changes. Historians examining the rise of civilizations need to factor in religious motivation as a primary driver, not a secondary effect. The emergence of states, cities, writing, complex social hierarchies, these might be driven as much by ideological factors as by economic ones. People come together and create complex institutions not just to organize food production more efficiently, but because shared beliefs demand it. Sociologists thinking about social organization and what binds communities need to take seriously the power of shared worldview, shared ritual, shared sacred space. We often think about societies as collections of individuals cooperating for material benefit. But Göbekli Tepe suggests that humans will organize themselves around abstract beliefs and ritual commitments, even when there's no obvious material benefit, even when it requires enormous sacrifice. Even economists studying development and social change need to account for non-material incentives. Standard economic models assume people are rational actors maximizing utility, making decisions based on cost-benefit analysis. But building Göbekli Tepe made no economic sense. The cost-benefit ratio was terrible, yet people did it anyway, willingly, enthusiastically, for over a millennium. That requires incorporating different kinds of motivation into our models of human behavior. The discovery also forced archaeologists to reconsider other sites from this period and earlier. How many Neolithic settlements are actually settlements that formed around ritual centres? How many early agricultural sites started as gathering places for pre-agricultural peoples performing ceremonies, with farming developing later to support those gatherings? The interpretive framework shifted. Suddenly, ritual explanations that had been dismissed as unprovable speculation became central to understanding the archaeological record. Çatalhöyük in central Turkey, one of the most famous Neolithic sites excavated since the 1960s, is being reconsidered in light of Göbekli Tepe. Çatalhöyük dates to about 7500 BCE, several thousand years after Göbekli Tepe. It's a large settlement, maybe 10,000 people at its peak, with distinctive mud brick houses packed tightly together, elaborate wall paintings, plastered skulls, bull horns mounted in buildings. Archaeologists have long debated whether these buildings were houses with domestic shrines or actual temples. Göbekli Tepe shifts the interpretation. Maybe Çatalhöyük started as a ritual centre that only later became a full urban settlement. Maybe the buildings with the most elaborate artwork were temples first, incorporated into houses later. Sites in other regions are being re-evaluated through the Göbekli Tepe lens. Poverty Point in Louisiana, a massive earthwork complex built by hunter-gatherers around 1700–1100 BCE, suddenly makes more sense. We can now understand how mobile foragers could create monumental architecture if properly motivated. The stone circles of Britain and Ireland, some dating to the early Neolithic around 4000–3000 BCE, might represent similar phenomena, ritual monuments built during the transition to agriculture, possibly driving that transition rather than resulting from it. The megalithic structures of Brittany and France, the massive stone rows at Karnak dating to around 4500 BCE, might tell similar stories. Maybe these weren't built by established agricultural societies as we'd assumed. Maybe they were built during the transition, by people still partially reliant on wild resources, using ritual monuments as focal points for social organisation. The elaborate earthworks of the Amazon basin, vast geometric structures covering hundreds of acres, are being reconsidered. These were built by societies we'd classified as simple tribal groups. But maybe they were more complex than we thought. Maybe they organised themselves around ritual and sacred geography in ways we hadn't appreciated. Göbekli Tepe provides a model for understanding how this could happen. The theoretical debates sparked by Göbekli Tepe fill academic journals and conferences. Some archaeologists argue that Klaus Schmidt overstated the religious interpretation. Maybe Göbekli Tepe had practical functions we're missing. Maybe it was a gathering place for exchange and social bonding that only incidentally included ritual. Maybe the structures had astronomical purposes related to tracking seasons and predicting resource availability. Maybe the massive gatherings were about establishing social networks and alliances as much as about religion. Others argue Schmidt didn't go far enough, that Göbekli Tepe represents a completely different form of social organisation we don't have conceptual frameworks for yet. Maybe the builder society was neither truly hunter-gatherer nor agricultural but something in between, a transitional form that doesn't fit our categories. Maybe the site challenges our entire system of classifying prehistoric societies into neat stages: hunter-gatherer, Neolithic, Bronze Age. Maybe human social organisation is more fluid and variable than our typologies allow. What everyone agrees on is that Göbekli Tepe can't be ignored or explained away. It exists. It's dated reliably using multiple independent methods. It demonstrates capabilities and social complexity we didn't think possible for pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers. Any theory about the Neolithic transition, about the origins of agriculture, about the development of social complexity, about the relationship between material conditions and cultural development, has to account for it. You can't just dismiss it as an anomaly. You have to explain how it was possible and what it means. The old narratives don't work anymore. The simple linear progression from foraging to farming to complexity to civilization That's been completely demolished. We need new frameworks that can explain how and why pre-agricultural peoples built monuments, how ritual and belief can drive material changes, how social complexity can emerge without agriculture, how human capabilities and motivations are more varied and sophisticated than we'd imagined. And this is science working exactly as it should. New evidence appears that contradicts existing theories. Old frameworks get modified or discarded. New models emerge that better account for the data. Understanding improves, gets more accurate, more complete, more nuanced. The process is messy, involves controversy and debate and wounded egos and academic fights. But ultimately we get closer to truth. We understand our past better. We understand ourselves better. Your ancestors were capable of things we never imagined. They had motivations we never credited them with. They organized themselves in ways we never thought possible for their technological and economic level. They invested their time and energy in creating meaning, in building connections to forces beyond the material world, in constructing sacred spaces that would outlast them. And they did it 11,600 years ago, at the very threshold of what we call civilization, before they'd invented farming or cities or writing or any of the other things we thought were prerequisites for complex culture. Göbekli Tepe hasn't just rewritten one chapter of human history, it's forced us to reconsider the entire narrative. Every assumption about what ancient people could and couldn't do, about what drives human innovation and social change, about the sequence of developments leading to civilization, about the relationship between material conditions and cultural expression, all of it needs to be reconsidered in light of those carved pillars standing in the darkness 11,600 years ago. The story of human civilization is longer than we thought, stranger than we imagined, more sophisticated in its beginnings than we'd given our ancestors credit for. We built temples before cities. We created sacred landscapes before agricultural fields. We invested in ritual and meaning before we'd secured our food supply. We were complex before we were settled. We were sophisticated before we were civilized, at least as we'd defined civilization, and we're still discovering just how much we didn't know, still excavating sites that challenge our assumptions, still finding evidence that our ancestors were more capable, more creative, more driven by non-material concerns than any theory had predicted, still refining our understanding of where we came from and how we got here. The revolution that Göbekli Tepe started in our understanding of prehistory is still unfolding, still revealing implications we haven't fully processed, still reshaping how we tell the story of human origins and what it means to be human. So, here we are in 2024, looking back across 11,600 years at a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, where people who had no farms, no cities, no writing, no metal tools, no wheels, no draft animals, no pottery initially, none of the things we associate with civilization, somehow organized themselves to build something that would survive into our era and force us to completely reconsider everything we thought we knew about our past. This isn't just one archaeological site being remarkable. It's a perfect storm of factors that converged at a specific moment in human history to make something unprecedented possible. First, environmental abundance. The warming climate after the Ice Age, the retreat of glaciers, the expansion of forests and grasslands, the proliferation of wild cereals and game animals, all of this created conditions where wild resources were so plentiful that hunter-gatherers could generate surplus time and energy. Your ancestors in southeastern Turkey around 9600 BCE lived in optimal conditions, a landscape that provided everything they needed without the intensive labour that farming would later require. That abundance created possibility, freed people from the constant struggle for calories, made it feasible to invest thousands of hours in activities that didn't directly contribute to food acquisition. Second, cultural motivation. Somewhere deep in the human lineage, probably developing over hundreds of thousands of years, we evolved the drive to create meaning, to build connections with forces beyond the material world, to invest resources in ritual and ceremony and sacred space. That motivation, that need to make life sacred rather than just survivable, to connect with ancestors or spirits or gods, to mark territory as meaningful, drove your ancestors to choose to build when they could have just feasted and moved on. This wasn't practical. It wasn't economically rational. It was spiritual, psychological, driven by needs that transcend survival. Third, social and cognitive capability. By 11,600 years ago, humans had evolved all the mental and social tools needed for complex coordination. Language sophisticated enough to transmit detailed knowledge across generations. Theory of mind advanced enough to maintain relationships across distances and time. Memory systems capable of preserving traditions through decades and centuries. Planning abilities that could conceptualize multi-year projects. Social intelligence that could organize hundreds of people, resolve conflicts, maintain cooperation. We had the cognitive software for civilization, even before we developed the material hardware of agriculture and cities. Fourth, the genetic legacy of earlier bottlenecks meant all humans were closely related, shared similar cognitive capabilities, could communicate and cooperate across apparent boundaries. The genetic homogeneity that limited our physical evolution enabled our cultural evolution by making it easier for innovations and ideas to spread, by ensuring that knowledge developed in one group could be understood and adopted by others. Fifth, the timing. This happened at exactly the right moment, at the threshold between the Ice Age world and the post-glacial world, early enough that the hunter-gatherer worldview was still dominant, still shaping how people understood themselves and nature, late enough that climate stability enabled sustained occupation of the region, that resources were abundant enough to support large gatherings, that population density was high enough to provide labour for construction. The window was narrow, historically speaking, and Göbekli Tepe fit through it perfectly. These factors came together once, in one place, at one time. They produced something that would remain the oldest known temple complex for 11,000 years, until we finally found it and recognised what it meant. This wasn't inevitable. It wasn't a necessary stage that all human societies pass through. It was a specific response to specific conditions by specific people who made specific choices about how to use their time and energy and resources. And those choices, those decisions by hunter-gatherers to build something permanent and sacred, rather than just living day to day, rippled forward through time in ways the builders couldn't have imagined. They created pressures that drove agricultural development. They established patterns of seasonal gathering and feasting that evolved into permanent settlement. They generated social complexity that persisted and grew. They started processes that led, over millennia, to cities and states, and empires, and all the structures we call civilization. You are the descendant of those builders, the inheritor of that drive to create meaning, to build beyond immediate need, to invest in connection with something larger than individual survival. That impulse, that need to make life sacred and meaningful, it's still in you. It's in everyone. It's what makes us human in a way that transcends our physical form, in a way that goes deeper than our genes, in a way that connects us across 11,600 years to people who looked at a hilltop and decided to create something that would last forever. If you've made it this far into our journey tonight, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a like if this story kept you company. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from, what time it is, whether this changed how you think about human history or about what drives us to create, and subscribe if you want more explorations of the deep mysteries that made us who we are. Now let that settle into your thoughts as you drift off. Somewhere beneath a hill in Turkey, 95% of Göbekli Tepe still waits in the darkness, holding secrets about your ancestors that we haven't even begun to discover. Those massive pillars standing in their circles, carved with animals we can identify and symbols we can't yet read. Those elaborate structures built with stone tools and human muscle and unstoppable determination. That sacred landscape created by people who chose meaning over ease, ritual over comfort, permanence over convenience, who invested everything in building something that would speak across 11,600 years. They built cathedrals before they planted crops. They created temples before they built houses. They devoted generations to something that had no survival value, no practical function, no economic benefit, because they understood something we sometimes forget, that humans need meaning as much as we need food, that we need connection to forces beyond ourselves as much as we need shelter, that we need to create something lasting as much as we need to survive today. Your ancestors weren't primitives barely scratching out existence. They were sophisticated, capable, creative people who mastered their environment so thoroughly they could afford to dream, to build, to create sacred space that would last forever. They were us, fundamentally, with the same drives and needs and capabilities, just living in a different time with different technologies, but the same essential humanity. Sleep well. sleep.